Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to have a plenary lecture which complements all the many weeks of activities here at the Barcelona School of Economics in the context of the Summer Forum. I don't have much to add to this. In the name of the Barcelona School of Economics, very happy to see many familiar faces here, and very happy to have Andrei Shleifer. I'm going to give the word to Maria for an introduction.
Okay, so thank you, John.
This is all the introduction?
Yes.
Please sit down.
No. I am very humbled to stand here next to one of the greatest economists of our time. I am very honored to be able to introduce Andrei Shleifer, John Loeb Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Holds an undergraduate degree from Harvard and a PhD from MIT. Before coming to Harvard at 1991, he has also taught at Princeton and Chicago Business School. He is the recipient of John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association. He has also many other distinctions. For example, he is a fellow of the Econometric Society, American Economic Association, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and American Finance Association. The first thing to mention is that Andrei is an economist with a very great impact on the profession. According to Google Scholar, he has more than 460,000 citations overall. So when I looked at it, I was shocked. I thought that it can't be that high for an economist, but apparently it happens. And more than 1,000 of these citations are after 2021. And which is alone more than combined citations of the total faculty of economics in most departments in the world. According to RIPEC, he is also the most cited economist in the world. So second, for me it's second, but you can pick yours. He is an absolute outlier in the number of PhD students who work in leading economic departments that he advised, competing possibly only with his colleague Larry Katz. I was extremely lucky in my life to have Andrei as my advisor. Giacomo Pancetta from Cray and Ruben Enikolopov from UPF also share this honor. Advising new generations of students is one of the most contributions to the profession that one could make, and Andrei has always been absolutely brilliant in that. Third, Andrei made fundamental contributions to several completely different fields of study, such as corporate finance, law and economics, political economy, behavioral economics. And in some cases, he is basically one of the founders of the whole fields, such as behavioral finance. More recently, his research is focused on the foundations of behavioral economics more generally, which is going to be the topic of today's lecture. Also, last but not least, I should mention that Andrei has been co-editor for the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the leading journal in our profession for many years. The citation record of QJE is pretty amazing. Nobody really knows how they managed to do it. Nobody can replicate that, no other journal. And I know that the only reason why it could be possible is thanks to the great talent of editors, including Andrei. Thanks a lot, Andrei, for agreeing to come to Barcelona and to speak at the BSE Summer Forum. I should also thank Barcelona School of Economics and Barcelona Institute for Political Economy and Governance for making it happen. Andrei, the floor is yours. You have 60 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcia. Thank you. Okay. Well, I don't know exactly what to do with an introduction like this, so just move on. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's have some fun. So what I will try to do today is to kind of give you a bunch of different things about this field that seems to be emerging, or this area that's emerging, which is cognitive economics, which is the idea of using pretty well established or understood psychological mechanisms in the brain, things like memory and attention, in order to model or understand human beliefs. Let me start with a very famous image from, actually, it's from the 19th century German magazine, satirical magazine, which is Duck Rabbit. Now, if you look at this image, you can see one of two animals. If you look from left to right, you can see that on the left you have the beak of a duck and you see the eye of a duck. So that would be a duck. If you look in the other direction, you might see the mouth and the eye of a rabbit and the ears of the rabbit on the left. So you can see one, you can see the other. Actually, if you close your eyes, you can switch which one you see. Our brain does not allow us to see both at the same time. And so part of what cognition is about is realization that different people see different things, form different beliefs, make different decisions based on the same information. Let me give you some kind of more practical examples on the duck rabbit. Is President Trump a criminal or a champion of ordinary Americans? Some people think he's the first. Other people think he's the second. Very few people think he's both. Is abortion a human right or a murder? That's a very good example, because there are many, many millions of people who think the first, particularly in the United States, and in Europe as well. There are many, many millions of people who think the second. It's impossible for somebody, or it never happens that somebody says, well, it's two sides of the same coin, I can see both sides of it. Is buying a stock a risk or an opportunity? Does owning a gun bring safety or increase the risk of accidents? Turns out that 60% of Americans own guns. Of the remaining 40%, more than half would like to own a gun. Okay, so it's not some kind of an aberration of some weirdos in strange states. But what's also true is that every person who owns a gun or wants to own a gun, as well as people who don't own guns, think that their only objective is safety of themselves and their family. The utility function is the same for everybody. There are people who think that owning a gun makes them safer against invasion of their home. There are people who think that owning a gun makes them less safe because of the risk of an accident. Hardly anybody sees both sides of the issue. Again, same information, same preferences, absolutely different views of the world. So it seems that in many social situations, economic situations, how people make decisions, how people form beliefs depend on how they look at it. So they use different models and representations to answer the same questions and come up with different answers. And so the question that arises, where are these models or representations coming from? Let me start with a very classic experiment of Kahneman and Tversky, which is 45 years old. And the experiment goes as follows, and I'll use this to motivate the rest of my talk. Here is what they wrote. Imagine that the US is preparing for an outbreak of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. 2 alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact estimate of the consequences of the programs are as follows. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. So the majority of people in this setting behave in a risk-averse way, act in a risk-averse way, and they choose program A. They asked a different group of people the following question. Same setup, exactly same word. If program C is adopted, 400 people will die for sure. If program D is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die and 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. So program A and program C are identical, so are programs B and D. But now the majority of respondents choose program D. They switch. What's important about this example is it cannot be preferences, as long as preferences are defined on payoffs. It cannot be beliefs as long as beliefs are defined on payoffs. It has to be the case that framing or description or what thoughts come to mind when the problem is presented change how the problem is solved. Same is the case with guns, the same is the case with abortion, perhaps, and so on. And so the question is, given how universal this kind of question is, and it's not an aberration, it's an issue that confronts some of the central problems of our lives, can we start thinking about them? Can we start analyzing these problems? And maybe they can help us with more standard economic problems, which is what I'll try to suggest. I want to say that it's not just experiments. Accounts that are based on stable preferences are crumbling across the board. In finance and macro, market participants' beliefs exhibit systematic errors. Much of the predictability of stock returns and macro volatility reflects these expectations errors, not risk premia. The evidence at this point is completely overwhelming that risk accounts of return patterns in financial markets are just wrong, and that one needs to use accounts that have to do with expectations in order to explain the evidence. We see in interpersonal relations, in topics such as disagreement or conflict or discrimination, that choices reflect beliefs which are often completely inaccurate, rather than preferences. In consumer decisions, there is growing evidence of errors, with consumers attending to specific features of the problem and ignoring others. So, the edifice is cracking. The question is, can we make progress replacing it? So in neoclassical economics, preferences are stable. I should say that in behavioral economics, or traditional behavioral economics, stable preferences and stable beliefs are replaced by more general formulations of preferences and distorted, systematically distorted models of beliefs. But the world is much wilder. In the world, beliefs are heterogeneous, and more importantly, as you saw from the Kahneman and Tversky example, they're unstable. They change when you change description of the problem, context, words. And so we need to try to think about what it is that people are doing and how they solve this problem, we need to get inside people's heads. There is a nice paper from 20 years ago by Gull and Pessendorfer. I think some of you may have seen it, maybe it's too old, called The Case for Mindless Economics, which basically says that if we suitably alter or generalize preferences, we can account for the evidence. That would be nice, but it's false. And so the question is, how do we move forward? And so when I mention cognitive economics, what I mean is it's a slightly different approach, which is we start with psychological phenomena for which there is often quite a bit of empirical evidence. What these phenomena give us, what memory and attention give us, is a representation of the problem, which is to say, a theory of how people think about a problem. What are the features of a problem that they think are important for solving it, and what are the features that are not important? Some features receive excessive attention, some people receive too little attention and choice. And from that representation, people form beliefs and people make choices. And what we want to do is to load up everything on representations, which is to say we want to have a completely standard model of choice conditional on how people think about the problem. And what we want to try to understand is how people think about the problem, how it is that representations change. So in this talk, I'll sort of move backwards. First, I'm going to talk about beliefs and the evidence on beliefs, which has been really, there's been an explosion of beliefs. You know, Albert is here. An explosion of interest in beliefs and expectations in economics over the last 10, 15 years. And then I'm going to ask, where do beliefs come from? And I'll try to talk about the role of memory and attention and how they shape representations or models people use and choices they make. But the idea is that the starting point has to be what's inside people's heads. What are the mechanisms of cognition that shape or determine how we think about the problem? And of course, also explain why different people think about the problem so differently. Okay, let me start. And again, I'm going to go through dozens of things, or a dozen things, not dozen, that they all show like maybe different features of what I'm trying to describe. But let me start with beliefs. I want to start with maybe one of the all-time classics, the paper that established the field of behavioral finance, which is Shiller's paper on access volatility. And what Shiller did is he started with the present value formula, which is to say that the value or the price of a security in an efficient market is the expected present value of future cash flows. He used, he said, let's start with rational expectations. Let's assume a constant discount rate. And if we have information about future dividends, we can compute at least the realization of the right-hand side of the equation. So his proxy for the value of the stock market, and he looked at the aggregate stock market, was the present value of perfect foresight dividends. And what Shiller showed is, and this is actually, his paper was in 1980, so this is starting in 82 and going for 40 years, just like he did. The blue line here is what the present value of future dividend looks like, and it doesn't move around at all. And the green line is the value of the Standard & Poor's 500 index in the US market. Okay? And so this is the excess volatility puzzle. The stock market exhibits enormous fluctuations. and the present value of future dividends, the realized present value of future dividends, doesn't move. So what do you do with this? Okay, this is a big problem. Well, if you look at the formula, you can maintain the assumption of rational expectations, and you can start playing with the denominator and make the denominator, which is to say the discount rate, volatile, which will make the present value volatile, which is where all of finance, of standard finance, has gone. Or you can go beyond the assumption of rational expectations and think about the numerator, and maybe the expectation of future dividends is not the rational expectation. So what happens? Well, it turns out, so the standard approach here, as I said, which is most forcefully articulated by John Cochrane, is to say, let's assume time-varying risk aversion and try to use preferences to solve the puzzle. And as Cochrane said, in good times, the average investor is surely feeling less risk averse, which means that in good times, stock prices are going to be even higher than the present value at the fixed discount rate, and in bad times, it's going to be even lower. An alternative is to say, well, actually, we measure the numerator here because we have data on expectations of future earnings. We have survey expectations of analysts or many other categories. So what if instead of postulating rational expectations, we look at measured expectation of future cash flows of future dividends at a constant discount rate? So we don't mess with the numerator. We leave the numerator constant. Well, what does it look like? You fit excess volatility almost perfectly, which is to say that stock market is volatile because beliefs are volatile. Those are two parts of the same coin. So we don't need to make any assumption about discount rates. The data say that the phenomenon of volatile beliefs and the phenomenon of volatile stock prices are very closely related to each other. It actually works not just in the time series, but also in a cross-section. And since this is not a finance audience, I'll go through it very quickly, which is that actually you can ask how much of the, first of all, something about these expectations in the cross-section. One way to detect incorrect beliefs is that errors in expectations are predictable. So that turns out to be the case. So when people are very optimistic about future earnings growth, in fact, on average, they're going to be disappointed and expectations are going to come down. Not only that, the decline in expectations is correlated with the actual stock returns going forward, which is to say that this disappointment in beliefs is strongly correlated with returns. And not only that, if I stand here at the time, T, and I look at the forecast of future earnings growth, and I predict, given this forecast, what the error in expectations is going to be, that predicted error is highly correlated with future returns. Okay, again, these are not R squares of one. There is a lot of excess volatility. It's not, but you have predictability that is directly contradicts, not just contradicts market efficiency, but also tells you about the mechanism of market inefficiency, which is its excessively volatile beliefs. This also works in the cross-section. So this is something called the value premium. Let me skip that. But again, expectations account for the evidence. It's not only in finance, it's also in macro. The same kind of mechanism as I've just described accounts for, at least in part, for volatility of investment and volatility of credit spreads, which people have recognized as being important for credit cycles. Okay, so now I want to move a little bit back and say, what are the mechanisms of expectations? So I want to try to, again, this is like an intermediate step, not go all the way to memory and attention, but talk about the mechanism. The first step is to look at expectation formation in light of data. And again, we're getting to the idea that the way in which people form expectations is that they retrieve episodes given the signal or given the data that are more similar to the data at the expense of the episodes going forward that are less similar to the data. So we call this idea diagnostic expectations or stereotypes, but basically we think of this as a distortion of the distribution function, of the density function of future realizations of future states. So just to illustrate, okay, I'm going to do my experiment. If you heard me do this, don't answer. Suppose I tell you that a person is Irish, and I ask you, what are the chances that they have red hair? Okay, does anybody want to give me an estimate? I need a couple of estimates from the room. 15, 30? Okay. Well, think about how you solved this problem. You thought, well, there's a lot of red-haired Irish, so I'm going to make a high estimate. Well, in fact, it's only 10%. But of course, what's important is that there are much more red-haired people among the Irish than in any other group. And so when we think about whom red-haired people are similar to, it's the Irish, and whom red-haired people are dissimilar from, it's everybody else. So the theory says that, and I will talk about the memory foundations of it, that the number of red-haired Irish is going to be overestimated. And in fact, almost always people overestimate this. The representative Irish people have red hair, even though the average Irish person has light or dark hair as everywhere else in the world. It's the distinctive types that get overrepresented. I'll give you another example. You know, what fraction of people living in Florida are over 65? Anybody want to guess? 50. Thank you. I didn't pay him. No, it's actually 18% versus 17% in the rest of the U.S. Okay, so it's a tiny bit high. And why is that? Because when you think about people living in Florida, we think about people living in Miami and in Palm Beach. And those people tend to be older. The people who live in, it's a huge state, and the people actually who live in the rest of the state are younger than people elsewhere. So we overestimate unusual or representative or distinctive types, or the types that feel most similar. It's actually the same is true about the stock market. If you look at the distribution of future earnings growth of rapidly growing companies, it's actually faster than that of regular companies, but the difference between the distributions is the greatest on the right tail. And so because the difference in the distribution, the stocks that are most similar to a rapidly growing company are stocks like Google, or now it would be OpenAI. And so that's what comes to mind, and that leads to overestimation of the growth rate. That's also true in the data. That's also true in the data. So when thinking about the Irish, we remember the most distinctive hair color relative to other populations. That gives us an overestimate. When thinking about fast-growing firms, we remember the most distinctive Googles. We overweight this memorable type, overemphasizing differences. I will show you, this is a beautiful picture. So you take a group of people, some Democrats, some Republicans. You ask them what are their views on 50 issues. You ask every person their views on 50 issues. Okay? And then you ask them, what is the view of people in your party, and what are the views of people in the other party about the same issue? Okay? So from the sample, you have the true distribution of views among the Republicans. You have a true distribution of views among the Democrats. And you have the distribution of beliefs. Okay, on every single issue but one, believed distributions are more extreme than true distributions. Every single issue but one. And who is doing the believing doesn't matter. Both Republicans and Democrats think that Democrats are more liberal than they really are. And both Republicans and Democrats think that Republicans are more conservative than they really are. So it's not motivated beliefs or anything like that. It's stereotyping. We stereotype, people stereotype groups using these kinds of representativeness mechanism. And of course, it also explains why, contrary to Arrow and Phelps, stereotype beliefs are not accurate in equilibrium. They're massively distorted in equilibrium. People have incorrect beliefs about gender, about race, and so on. Let me skip this. Okay, so I'm now going to get to there is no clock here, so somebody's going to have to tell me how I'm doing on time. So I want to talk about foundations. So we have these beliefs. So what we know from development economics, from labor economics, from macro, from finance, is that beliefs are systematically inaccurate. Errors are predictable, people disagree, beliefs are volatile. What do we do with this? And that they determine behavior, they shape behavior. It's not that there is beliefs, data, and behavior doesn't matter. And in developing country contexts, this is actually serious stuff. People don't buy crop insurance. People put wrong seeds into the ground. People make decisions which cost a tremendous amount of welfare because they don't have correct beliefs in repeated situations. And so how do we think about it? What can we do about it? So let me spend some time on memory and then some time on attention. Memory is a very, very old field in psychology. It's 150 years old. And there is a standard memory experiment, okay, which is people are given a list of words. This goes back to Ebbinghaus in Germany in the 70s. Given a list of words, and then they asked to remember what was on the list. And sometimes they asked to remember without any more information, just asked to recall the words they saw. Sometimes they're asked whether a particular word was on the list. So there is some variation, but it's always the same thing, and these people run these experiments today as well. That's the main thing. And so there is an encoding, you get a list of words, you're asked to do some addition, a task, and then there is free recall. That's the standard experiment. And there are basically 3 or 4 principles of what people remember. So the first principle is serial position, which is people remember better the first words on the list and the last words on the list. The first words on the list, they probably remember better because they know the task and they rehearse them or they really try to remember them. The last words on the list is known as the recency effect. There is contiguity, which is to say nobody's ever done anything with it, which is if I remember a word, I'm more likely to remember a word that's next to it. That's like a very important, if you read books about people with perfect memory, contiguity is how people with perfect memory or people remember things. And lastly, there is semantic similarity, and that's really important, which is to say, if I remember a word and there are words that are similar to it, you know, of the same type, I'm more likely to remember those words. So there is a structure to recall. Now, so the question is, what can one do with this structure, and can one bring it into economics? And I think there are two parts to it. The first one is very old, and the second one is very new. The part that's very old is what's recalled, what's retrieved. I've shown you the data, and there are basically 2 or 3 rules of retrieval, the most important one of which is associativeness, which is to say that you remember things that are more similar to the cue or to the prompt that you've received. And I'll show you how it works. And the second idea, which is much cooler and is much more recent, and this idea is due to Hassabis, the same person who was a chess prodigy and then was a physics prodigy at Cambridge, and then right before, a few years before he started DeepMind, he was a neuroscientist because he thought neuroscience was more interesting than physics. God only knows what he would have done if he went into physics. But in neuroscience, he made a fantastic contribution, which is that he discovered that the mechanisms of retrieval from memory and the mechanisms of forming beliefs and expectations go through exactly the same, and I don't mean similar, exactly the same neural chains. Okay? Retrieval and belief formation are the same process. What that means is that you can measure in rats, and you measure you can measure electrical and chemical connections between neurons, so you can trace this, because you can put electrodes inside the rats' brains. You can also do this with humans who have hippocampal lesions. So people who can't remember things can't form expectations. Okay, it's one and the same. So this gives us kind of some guidance for how we build models of belief formation, incorporating both the mechanisms of retrieval and mechanisms of what Hassabis and Schechter called simulation, which are so similar. Now, these mechanisms also make predictions that one can bring to the data, which is what they say is if irrelevant experiences, that irrelevant experiences will shape beliefs if they're cued and help retrieval and simulation. So if I get you to remember something or think about something, even if it's not particularly fundamentally relevant, it can shape your beliefs. And I'm going to show you how that can be brought to the data. And what is also the case is experiences simply may not be retrieved despite being relevant because they're overshadowed in retrieval by other experiences. So let me talk about how one models this. So the first is just putting the standard ideas about memory into a simple equation. So it says that the probability for a given Q, C, for a given question or hypothesis or what have you, that it's being retrieved, that experience E, is being retrieved, is proportional to the similarity between the experience and the cue, is proportional to the frequency with which this experience was had by the decision maker, and inversely proportional by all the other experiences that flood the mind when a choice is cued, or when a hypothesis is cued. Okay? What's very important in this expression is that either by asking people or looking at the data, we can measure similarity, which turns out to be the most important object in memory research. If we have experiences of people, what they've bought before, or what inflation episodes they lived through, and so on, we can have estimates of frequency of experiences, and perhaps we can have estimates of interference. Okay, so this is actually something that one can do and implement and try to measure, and in fact, there's been an explosion of research trying to do exactly that. We don't really know how to measure simulation or how to deal with simulation, although one indirect way of dealing with simulation, the Hassabis idea, is to ask people how they're thinking about the problem and to measure their reasoning, because reasoning is going to be, or the explanations of what they're doing, is going to be intimately related to what people are thinking about. But in this framework, the expectations are going to be given by retrieval, probability of retrieval weighting, simulation of experiences. But what simulation tells us is two things. First of all, if I forecast inflation, for example, my history with inflation or grocery prices or what have you is going to shape very directly how I forecast future inflation. That's very closely related to extrapolation. But also if an experience is similar in some other margin, it may also shape my beliefs. And I'm going to show you that this is true in some data. Okay, so let me show you, I had a lot of stuff, I kind of distilled it. So this is a recent paper on inflation expectations. And it basically tries to evaluate the memory model from the perspective in this context. And so what we try to do is people have looked at inflation expectations along with other expectations. And what they've done is many things. Albert's done that, we've done that, is basically look at mostly domain-relevant experiences in trying to think about it. But here we try to go a little further and say, well, can I shape a person's beliefs about inflation by shaping what they're thinking about? So let me start with something pretty basic and not particularly new to us. We look at the survey of participants in the Dutch household panel survey in 24 and then in June and October. We look at the inflation beliefs, and we look at also their home price growth belief. But what we do, very importantly, is we look at a bunch of other things. And since, I've mentioned simulation, we ask them, when they make these estimates, after reporting beliefs, to write 3 or 4 sentences about thoughts or experiences that came to mind when answering the inflation or home price growth questions. So this is just the first step, which is we're trying to relate beliefs and experiences. And the thing we do is we say, well, obviously people have said that experiences with prices or with gasoline prices will influence beliefs. But what about experiences that have nothing to do with inflation? You know, things like financial adversity or even health adversity. The question is whether the Q increases salience of adversity with no information about macro variables. And then we do a second thing, which is we say, well, this turns out to be true in fact, but that's known. And then we ask the question, well, suppose I can get a person to think about a health adversity. So I cue health adversity rather than look just at people's experiences before I ask people to make an inflation forecast. Or I cue a financial adversity, a health adversity, before I ask people to make an inflation forecast. There is no information provision here. And in fact, the question I cue is only similar to inflation in the sense that it's bad. In the sense that it's bad. So I put people into frame of mind, literally, of thinking about bad stuff. The question is, what is the effect of that cue on inflation forecasts? And if memory is what determines beliefs, what it shapes beliefs, then the prediction is that putting people in the frame of mind where they think about bad stuff gets them to, if they actually experience the bad stuff, raises their inflation forecasts. Well, so here's what the data looks like. Finance experiences, the left column is the control sample. These are people who are not primed. The right column is the treated sample. These are people who have been primed or who have been asked before the inflation forecast about whether they had a health or a financial adversity. And what you find is that finance experiences actually do affect inflation forecasts. Health experiences, which are quite different, have a much smaller effect. But what you also find is that the primes have huge effects. No information, just asking people, did you have a bad event? And this is direct evidence of the Hassabis-Schechter simulation mechanism, because when I think about inflation, when I'm put in a frame of mind, when I think about adversities, I give high inflation estimates. I should also say this only works for people who have had the experience, just as the model predicts. So if people did not have a bad health experience, the prime does not affect their, does not raise inflation expectations, or if they did not have a financial adversity. So it looks like, in fact, the memory mechanism explains at least part of how people form inflation expectations. We do a lot of calculation in the paper. The magnitude of this effect is comparable to the magnitude of demographic effects. So these are not trivial small effects. Okay, we still this is still indirect. So then we do two more things. The first thing we do is we ask, and this is what the beauty of moving beyond choice and starting to think about these problems from the perspective of cognition. We ask people about their reasoning. We ask people, how are you thinking about this problem? Whether it's inflation or home price growth. And the second thing we do, and this is wild, truly wild, is after we cue people, we also ask them about past inflation. And the theory again predicts that, the rat Hassabis theory of memory says that if I prompt people to think about past inflation, then if I put them into this negative frame of mind, they're going to remember higher inflation than otherwise. Okay, so you can look at reasoning, you can look at backcasts. This is what you find. First of all, it's very interesting that in reasoning, just like with abortion, just like with duck rabbit, different people produce different reasons for their answers. Some people have what we call the neutral valence reasoning, which is they talk about interest, expectations, new economy, interest rates. Other people have negative valence in their answers. They talk about money, wages, less is the most common word in their answer, and so on. If you look at either the backcast or the incidence of personal or negative reasoning, you find that the health prime, the question of, did you have a bad health experiences, raises the memory of the past inflation, and also increases the incidence of personal and negative reasoning about inflation, and so does the finance prime. And again, I want to stress, these are quite big effects. Okay, they're comparable to demographic effects. And then the next thing you want to do is to see whether reasoning predicts beliefs. This is kind of an indirect test of the Hassabis mechanism, and the answer to that is also yes. Now, why does it matter for macroeconomics, for finance? Because the pieces of the story, the memory story I've been trying to describe, actually can be measured. We can measure experiences, we can measure cues, we can measure similarity, and it all more or less comes together. So beliefs exhibit remarkable disagreement and instability. They help explain economic choices without assuming crazy preferences, and memory helps with a lot of the evidence. Okay, so let me come to the crazy stuff now. Okay, so far I was disciplined. So attention is understood much less than memory, much less well than memory, and there is a lot of research on it. But it's also important. There's a lot less work on attention so far in economics. So William James defined attention as taking possession by the mind of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible trains of thought. Focalization is of its essence. Okay? So you see a sea of data, you don't know what to do with it. You have to solve the problem or evaluate a hypothesis. You attend to part of what you see. Okay? There is a question about how you attend to part of what you see. There is a lot of evidence on that. There is a lot of evidence on attention being quite deliberate. Some people think inattention is rational. I don't think there's much support for that idea. But there is certainly top-down attention that you think when you think a problem is important, that what determines what you attend to. There is also a hugely important component of involuntary or bottom-up attention that drives your beliefs, and I'll show you some evidence. Okay, Andrei, this is for you. So for some 70 years, economic theorists have been mesmerized, and rightly so, by the Allais paradox. And just to remind you, what the Allais paradox says is you have a choice between 2,400 for sure and a lottery of 2,500 with probability 33%, 2,400 with probability 66%, and 0 with probability 1%. Okay? And in this lottery, people, the vast majority of people behave in a risk-averse way, and they prefer the sure payoff. Okay, so what I do now is a change in payoffs. Can people hear me? This, I think, went out. Is a change in payoffs in which I replace 2400 with probability 0.66 by 0 with probability 0.66 in both lotteries, which should not change the preferences. So the one on the right becomes 2500 with probability 0.33 and 0 with probability 0.67. And the one on the left becomes 2400 with probability 34% and 0 with probability 66%. Okay, so the choice, if consistent choice, would be if people prefer the second lottery. In the first problem, they should prefer, okay, they should prefer the one on the right in the second problem. But in fact, people switch. And in the second problem, people prefer the one on the left. And there is a famous story about LA tricking Arrow, Samuelson, and everybody else with the LA paradox. Now, there have been many explanations proposed for why people switch. But if you look at this thing, and there have now been several dozens of experiments suggesting what I'm about to say is right, is just think about how you would look at this problem, how a human being would look at this problem. If you look at the top problem, what sticks out? There is one payoff that sticks out, and that's the 0. And that's what attention is drawn to. That's what people report they're thinking about when they make an answer, when they give an answer. And they behave in a risk-averse way. If you look at the second problem, what sticks out? Well, you know, both lotteries have a 0 with approximately the same probability. So 0 no longer sticks out. What sticks out is that the one on the left has 2500, the one on the right has 2400. So people choose the one on the left. You can measure attention. You can ask people how they made the choice. You can write these lotteries in different ways. It's always the same. What drives the choice is which aspects. People don't integrate things. They don't. What drives the choice is the features of the problem that draw people's attention. This is bottom-up attention. They don't have any priors about what kind of a problem this is. If you write the problem in a correlated way, in fact, you can write the problem in an uncorrelated way, and it's going to give you the same answer if you write it in a column format. People always behave in a risk-averse way. Okay, so there is no inconsistency. So again, once you start thinking, why am I illustrating this? Why am I talking about this with so much excitement? Is because if you just start thinking about the problem in a way, I mean, this is not rocket science. This is basic psychology of attention, pretty well understood. Features of the problem that stick out are the ones that draw attention and shape decisions. Here is another example, and then I'll conclude. I got it, thanks. Look at two problems. The problem on the left is the first big experiment in decision theory, which is the balls and urns problem. Urn A contains 80% green, 20% blue balls. Urn B contains 20% green, 80% blue balls. Computer selects urn A or B with probabilities 25 and 75%, draws a ball. The ball is green. What is the probability was drawn from urn A? So it's a Bayes rule problem. The correct answer is 57%. Here is the version of this problem from Kahneman and Tversky. There are two taxi cab companies, blue and green, according to the color of the cabs they run. 25% of the cabs are green, 75% are blue. The base rates are the same. A cab is involved in a hit-and-run accident, and a witness reports the cab as green. A test reveals that the witness can correctly identify each color cab with probability 80%. What is the probability the errant cab was green? I'm not going to give you a test. It's the same problem. And the answer is 57%. What happens in the data? You run it with the same subjects. You don't even need to change the subjects. Well, observation number one, no one is at the base rule. And I mean nobody. In both cases, people decide it's either a base rate problem or a likelihood problem. There's a bunch of people at the base rates in balls and urns. There is a bunch of people at the likelihood. There is obviously some noise. Okay? If you average them out, it looks like there is slight underreaction to the base estimate. And so the balls and urns problem has been used as a canonical example of underreaction to information, which is total bullshit, if I can use the expression, because the important fact is bimodality. The important fact is that nobody is aggregating information. They're looking at some features of the problem and not others. Taxi cabs, nobody at the base rule, consistent. There's a few people at the base rates, but a lot fewer. There are a lot more people at likelihood. So if you average, it looks like overreaction, which is taxi cabs has been used as introduction to overreaction models. Of course, that's not what's going on. What's going on in the data is that people, again, are looking at some information and not others. If you ask them what they paid attention to, they will tell you, consistent with their answers, that in taxi cabs, the majority of them will tell you they paid attention to the likelihood. In the balls and urns, they tell you they paid attention to the base rates. Why? Well, if you look at the language, the balls and urns problem is it's about urns at the end, not colors. So they look at the base rates. In the taxi cabs, I don't know that for sure. The question at the end is about the credibility of the witness, which is the likelihood. So they answer with likelihood. So that's reality, okay? So we need to have models that are about that, not about steady underreaction or overreaction or what have you. And I'm not going to try to talk about this right now, but it just tells you that the experimental evidence is really quite overwhelming on how people represent these problems. Here they represent it as a problem about base rate. First of all, different people represent the problem differently. That's the most important fact. Just like with duck rabbit, just like with duck rabbit, just like with abortion, just like with stock investments. But also the way they represent it leads them to pay attention to some features, not others. And that's how they answer the problem. Okay, so how do people solve problems? Step one, they ask what kind of a problem this is. They choose model representation based on memory and attention. Step two, representation tells you which features are important so you can solve it. And that gives you most of the results that I've described. And we've done some theoretical work with Giacomo Lanzani, who is a proper theorist trying to articulate this model, but that is the basic way forward. And what seems to be the case is that all the problems that I've described to you fit into this general approach, that representation, selection of features from memory, from using attention that you think are important for solving the problem is what shapes how you solve it, not your preferences and not stable distortions to beliefs. So that's my last slide. I'm on time. This is the ad that I've been obsessing about for many decades. It's one of the most famous ads. It's been around for 40 or 50 years when Avis was trying to take some business away from Hertz. The ad was, we're number two, we try harder. And they built their business on that ad. But are they an underdog or are they a loser? Well, some people think they're an underdog and they switched. Other people think they're a loser and they stayed with Hertz, so with somebody else. But this multimodality is at the heart of how we think. Thank you. Andrei has a question. Yes.
Just on the first picture. So I follow a bit, but the first picture keeps in my mind. I understand that the way one sees it, one sees one way, one sees a duck, or one sees what is it?
A rabbit.
A rabbit, and then that stays. But now imagine you have a population. Does it matter for all you have explained? What's the percentage of people that see a rabbit? What's the percentage that see the other? And how stable is that?
Again, this is a kind of experiment that many people have run experiments on. In this case, it's pretty evenly divided. And what's also important about this experiment is you can see either, which is to say that if you see a duck, you can close your eyes and you open them and you see a rabbit, which is not always the case. What's also interesting, it's kind of stupid. On Easter, many more people see a rabbit. It's true, which is exactly what memory would tell you. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing all of this. I wanted to ask for your perception about how these problems, cognitive economics, maybe behavioral sciences, will be impacted by AI. And oh no, this is a very broad question. So, I mean, maybe you can just share your summary view on that.
Well, I'm not sure I can provide a summary because I think it's hard. You know, the most recent interview that Amodei gave was to say that the hardest problem of AI, or the most important problem facing AI, is interpretability, which is to say we don't really understand how it works and why it works so incredibly well in many contexts, not in all contexts. So we basically, you know, we don't know much about how the human brain works. We know for sure that LLMs work differently. So the analogies are extremely dangerous and misleading, but we also don't really understand, and again, it's a duck rabbit, you know. There are people, most of whom own large labs, who think that these systems are perfect and are going to conquer the world and take over all the jobs, and they're unstoppable. And there are people like Ian LeCun or Sandel Mullainathan who think that they're just deeply flawed. So we haven't sorted this out. Having said that, you know, the analogy between trying to bring what we understand about the human brain to decision-making and belief formation is something we are making like very first steps in. LLMs are obviously much further ahead, but we don't exactly understand how they work so well. So yes, there are analogies, but I don't know what the limits are. I can tell you that I had a very, very brilliant undergraduate this year trying to understand how LLMs solve Kahneman and Tversky type problems. And what I learned and what he learned is, and I think people understand that, is they're even much more unstable with respect to cues and frames than humans are. So it's much more unstable. That is to say that you can, I don't think you could draw the boundary, but inconceivably irrelevant changes in how you frame the question or pose the question or the multiple choice you give to the algorithm lead to dramatic swings in answers. Part of it is, Anthropic has written about it, is I think it's called the persona. When you ask an algorithm a question, one of the things it tries to figure out is who you are, okay? Which frankly is terrible if you want to do economics comparative statics using algorithms, because you think you're changing the parameters of the problem, it thinks that a different person with different preferences and beliefs is asking the question. All of which is to say, we're at the beginning. On that part, we're really at the beginning. And I was kind of shocked when Amodei said that. But, you know, I totally understand. It's very different from the nuclear bomb, where they actually knew how it works and were trying to build it from first principle. Here, you know, they have the nuclear bomb, they just don't know how it works. Yeah.
I don't know if I understood properly, but you in the paper you talk about there are expectations on inflation and expectations on home prices, no? But you only talk about expectations on inflation. Is there any particular thing in home prices that makes them different in terms of your theory? Because in that respect, you can prime renters and owners in a different way,
Yes.
or they have different sensitivities, no?
Okay, so you're absolutely right. They're not exactly the same, but actually if you ask people, and so you might think that people think, particularly homeowners, think that home price growth is good. So two things in this regard. First is that the effects I describe are much stronger for renters than for homeowners, consistent with what you said. Point number two, even homeowners think that home price growth is bad. So if you ask about the words associated with home price growth, even homeowners
Even
talk
if they
about
don't have kids?
I mean, all these regressions control for the demographics and so on, yes. But that's what's true in the data.
Thank you, Andrei. Beautiful presentation. So you've told us about cognitive economics. Now I'm asking about the profession at large. Not everyone uses cognitive economics to tackle the question. So can you tell us a little bit about what fraction of the, like for what problems we should really be looking at these, and for what other problems we can sort of take our traditional, rational, stable preferences approach?
Look, I have a completely practical view of this. I have a completely practical view of this, which is why the example that I stressed was an applied example, and we've written other papers, we've written on advertising, you know, exclusively about the topics we know nothing about. This will succeed if it's useful. It's not going to succeed if it's not useful to applied economists, to macroeconomists, to financial economists, what have you. So what we've been trying to argue, to suggest, to encourage, whatever you want to say, is that in many, many domains, from political economy to macro to finance to development, which is super important, this is useful. This is useful and it can be done. Okay, the macroeconomists do everything through field experiments. Development economists do everything through field experiments. They're there to ask just a few more questions. They can actually get inside people's heads. It doesn't cost anything extra. And people have started doing that, understanding. I've said this at the beginning, how people make decisions about crops, how people make decisions about insurance, how people make decisions about seeds, is no extra work. And you can actually, rather than go back, go around and try to infer preferences from choices, which is how Samuelson destroyed 100 years of economics, you can actually get that data directly by asking people. Of course, there are all the concerns about, experimental demand, all these things people know how to deal with. But, all you need to do for a lot of these problems, not for all of these problems, but all you need to do is ask. And, there is shocking consistency, heterogeneity, also consistency. The reason people give the answers is because of how they think about the problem. They're not giving arbitrary, unthoughtful answers. They're giving very deliberate answers. It's just they're thinking about the problem.
Thanks, Andrei. So I was wondering, particularly motivated by your abortion example, whether and where you draw the line between beliefs and values, in the sense that I have mercifully not followed very much the abortion debate, but I thought that the number one feature is not quite that, some people ignore that allowing abortion results in babies not being born, and other people ignore that forbidding abortion involves women being forced to do what they don't like. Maybe there's a bit of that, but I thought this is mostly a value judgment of whether one of these two things is much more important than the other. And I can see vaguely some similarities, but I see it very vaguely, and I wonder if you have done this more in a more structured way.
So let me say a couple things. First of all, obviously, as you correctly say, abortion is kind of a more controversial and complicated example than some of the others I gave. What always strikes me about that example, and so, for example, gun ownership is a much cleaner example in the sense that people have dug in and figured out exactly how owners and non-owners think about the problem, and we have much more confidence that it's not values, it's beliefs. The thing that's interesting to me about abortion, maybe I shouldn't bring it up given all the baggage this comes with, is the extent to which people with different sets of views do not attend to the other features. I had an experience, it's a personal experience, where we had for dinner somebody, a very distinguished person in Boston, who was the non-executive head of what's the name of the organization? The main organization that works on women's issues, and main provider of abortion. I don't remember the name. Planned Parenthood, thank you. I'm sorry. It's too late for me. And the issue was whether the federal government should give Planned Parenthood money for abortions. And I said, well, you know, there are people who may take the point of view, given how divisive the issue is, that it shouldn't be the business of the federal government. And the person didn't speak to me for a year. And that was a reasonably close friend. So I don't know whether that distinguishes, but this idea that that was a legitimate, that there was a trade-off, whether there were two sides to the issue. It was really like duck rabbit from my perspective. So that moved me in the direction of thinking it's not just values, but also beliefs. And we also know, you know, there are all these experiments in which, again, in more neutral settings, you have people with divergent beliefs, you give them the same information, that pulls them apart. And when you ask them why it pulls them apart, is because in the same situation, some people saw some features and other people saw other features.
So more generally, how do you think these issues of representations and reasoning are related to communication patterns? Because like, for two reasons. One is like actually you can think about memory and experiences communicating with yourself. But second is a lot of this, what we call facts, they're not, we learn, it's like social cognition. We actually never observed it. We all take them from different people.
Okay, so this is a very cool question. So obviously, this once you start thinking about these problems in this way, the next step is persuasion. And this is where AI actually comes in, because there are now algorithms that people have developed that basically have AI persuade people on various issues. So I had another one of my great undergraduates, who's Australian, had 1,000 Australians being persuaded by AI to change their views on immigration. So, you know, sensitive issues, and Australians are quite hostile to immigration, even though it's a, you know, it's an empty country with huge needs for people. But in Australia, maybe like in Barcelona, the main argument against immigration is home price inflation, that there is not enough housing for everybody, which is kind of funny in an empty country. And so it turns out that AI was quite successful, and you could at least study what makes things persuasive. I can tell you what is the single strongest factor. Okay? It's not information, it's not rhetoric, it's not nationalism, it's empathy. But by like orders of magnitude. So if you tell people, if AI tells people, they know it's AI, they don't care, that they understand their point of view and they understand their concerns and they start from that. Again, I don't know what happens when they go to the voting booth and so on. But in terms of, you know, people saying, and you can see how people get persuaded, because when people are not persuaded, the answers get shorter. and then they kind of say, forget it. If they keep talking, they're much more likely to be persuaded. And again, this is AI discovered feature. This is not a feature that you sort of decide. AI then analyzes the text, and so you can, gives you some perspectives at least on how people think.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
That's it. It's
Yep.
too late.
Background question. What's your view of neuroeconomics? Or what does neuroeconomics play a role in on this?
Look, let me answer this. So in short answer, it died. The short answer, it died. And the reason it died is, people thought 20 years ago that it was extremely promising, and there were some aspects of like how long it takes people to make decisions and so on, where it looked very good. The problem is the challenges, and that is why I answered the question earlier, is that for these approaches to work, they need to be useful. They need to be useful for applied economists, for people, and they need to solve people's problems. People's meaning, academics' problems. And neuroeconomics, I don't think ever solved anybody's problems. And so, even though there is some very beautiful evidence, it never got into economics.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for staying with us this evening, and thanks a lot, Andrei. It was a great experience.